the first thing that we thought would be good to talk about is something that bothers me a lot, and I still struggle with. I don't know if I'll ever come to a place where I feel fully at peace. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, but is a God who loves us and is good in a world full of suffering, and how those things, what do we do with that? And I know you mentioned the other day that depends on who you're talking to, but I'll just let you kind
of. Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing we've talked about a lot is how one thing that's unique about the Bible is that it doesn't like gloss over questions like that. I mean, there are whole books devoted pretty much to that question in the Bible, like Job and Ecclesiastes. So, you know, being a Christian or having faith in God doesn't mean like you have to like just push those questions out of your mind. I mean, the Bible invites you to grapple with those things and talk about them. And it's not like a sign of being rebellious or having weak faith if you struggle with those questions, because I mean, the Bible invites you to struggle with those questions. I think it's actually a sign that you're paying attention. I mean, I think it's better to really be torn by those kind of things than to be indifferent. I mean, because Jesus is not indifferent about suffering. I mean, it's not good to be so torn up with it that it causes you to despair. But I think it's even worse to just be apathetic. You know. So if you're bothered by these things, it means that your heart is at least going in the right direction. You know.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of academic answers that are helpful up to a point. I mean, the basic Christian idea is that all the problems in the world stem from the fall. You know, the fact that the human race turned against God. And I think that's worth pointing out, because like it's not like this was all ever part of God's intention. You know. And that's, I guess, unique to some extent for Christians. I mean, because I think there are some religions that don't necessarily have a version of the fall. You know, the universe just is what it is. You know, and that seems to cast a shadow. Like if we believe that like God wanted the world to be the way it is, that would be very difficult to reconcile how God could be good if this was his plan. This was plan A. You know. Viewing it as plan B doesn't solve all the problems, but at least it puts it in a proper perspective, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, the scriptural account is that, you know, death came through sin. I mean, and it says the whole universe, the whole creation was cursed. And I don't really know exactly what all that means, but Genesis 3 mentions thorns and briars and increased pain in childbirth. I mean, just the whole natural order was thrown off kilter, you know?
What would that, I mean, presumably that would include like the entire universe, or just the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, because obviously the Bible is written for humans, and so that if there are other races somewhere out in the universe, we're just not invited to know anything about them. So, but I mean, yeah, I mean, I tend to think it would affect the entire universe, because. But I mean, that's a question that's kind of hard to wrap up. You know, like I know there are planets that have like cataclysmic weather and stuff like that, and I mean nobody's suffering, so I don't know if God would have wanted there to be a massive hurricane on Jupiter without the fall.
Right.
The fall, it's hard to say. But,
right. Yeah, like, and I mean, it's such a huge topic, and it could go in 1,000 different directions. But I mean, it's enough to think of the like decay that we find on Earth, the inevitable decay and death, but then to think about entropy in the universe itself, and that what all was included in the fall, what all was made sick by our
I mean, I think it's Romans 8. Paul uses the phrase the creation groans. And I mean, I don't know how literal he's intending to be, but creation means all that exists, you know.
That's right. Yeah.
So, yeah, it definitely had a huge effect. So yeah, I think it's helpful to start with, you know, the idea that this is not God's original plan. I guess that, you know, that tends to beg the question: why did God allow it, or why does God continue to allow things to go on as they are?
And that's not just. I mean, that can be an academic question, but that can also be a question filled with angst and pain.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first question is a little easier to answer than the question of why God allowed it initially is a little easier to answer than why God allows the universe to go on as it does. I mean, the initially, I mean, this may sound like a trite answer, but it's really the only answer people have to offer, is that the risk of the human race turning against God was inherent in there being a race that had the ability to make decisions, you know, by creating human beings that, you know, could love God or could turn away from God. Bound up in that was the inherent risk that, you know, if they turned away from God, all the consequences that would follow. I mean, the question of why God, you know, has allowed the earth to, you know, continue along its course this long. I mean, really, the only answer the Bible gives is that God is patient. And he's giving the human race, the earth, more and more time. So, I mean, we tend to look at the world and think, you know, God is indifferent or calloused or cruel because he's not jumping in right now. But, I mean, the scriptural answer is really opposite. He's not jumping in right now because he's not cruel. Because he's giving people more time to repent. Because jumping in, like, quote unquote, would mean, you know, devastation to everybody who's turned against him, you know.
Yeah. Because to a large degree, the suffering on earth is caused by human beings.
Yeah, I mean, most of it for sure. I mean, you have cataclysmic weather and things like that with the creation being cursed, but I mean, that's certainly outnumbered by this human cruelty to other humans.
Yeah, you were just showing a video today about the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
And man, it just... so you've kind of given an explanation of why, at least a very, you know, quick answers to why suffering exists, why God allows it to exist. I know that in addition to what you said, that people like Julian of Norwich, who wrote Revelations of Divine Love, just insisted over and over again in her revelations that even though it's really difficult to understand and endure, that God has our highest good in mind with these, allowing it to continue, and will make all things well again, and asks us to trust him, even through tears, you know. And what are some other works that you might recommend for someone struggling?
Well, I mean, to me, the best book on this specific topic is The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis wrote. It's a very dense book, you know, in that there's a lot packed in there. It's not a particularly long book. It's only 10 chapters, maybe 150 pages, somewhere in that range. It's academic, but it's not so academic that it's just like impossible to get through.
Yeah, he had an amazing way of presenting very academic things in very down-to-earth ways.
Yeah. I mean, there probably are other books out there that would be helpful too. I hesitate to recommend anything besides Problem of Pain, because typically when I read another book on the subject, I see other authors saying what Lewis said in an inferior way. So he just kind of nailed it, you know.
And to be clear, it is very academic. He admits in the beginning, this is for people grappling with the intellectual problem. People experiencing suffering actively won't necessarily want to, you know, be like, hey, this is a great argument. My suffering is lessened now.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there really is any kind of book you could read if you're in the midst of suffering that would do anything, that's significant. I mean, Lewis did write another book called A Grief Observed, which is really more for people who are like actually experiencing grief. He wrote that in the wake of his wife's death due to cancer, and it's not an academic book. It's just a very heartfelt, like, just look at the grief he's experiencing and trying to make sense of it, and wrestling himself with how to make sense of why God would allow his wife to suffer the way that she did.
And so soon after she entered his life.
Yeah, they were only married about 3 years. So the two books are kind of good to read kind of as companions. The first book is good if you're just trying to make sense of it, and wrap your head around some of these big concepts. And the second book is really more if you just need some comfort, on a more personal note.
Yeah. I don't know of any works, but particular quotes that have been really powerful for me. Dorothy Day, and I don't have the exact quote, but whatever game God is playing with his creation, referring to just how hard it is to exist. To exist means in some ways to suffer. There's a lot of joy and wonderful things as well, but you can't escape suffering and death. And so anyway, she says, whatever game God is playing with his creation, he's taken his own medicine.
Yeah.
And in the person of Jesus, he became a human being who experienced all the same things we're experiencing, and suffered and died and thought it well worthwhile. It's a paraphrase, but and then Nicholas Wolterstorff has an especially powerful quote, and I'm kind of grouping a couple of different quotes together here, but he wrote in Lament for a Son, after he lost his son in a tragic hiking accident. He's, as we all do, I think, and like Daniel said in the beginning, God allows this, and not only does he allow it, but he gives us the language with which to talk to him about it. In the Psalms, some of the Psalms are just heartbreaking. In Ecclesiastes and Job and various other places, but he's just incredibly humble to recognize our suffering and allow us to express it, even though he's completely trustworthy, But anyway, so the quote from Nicholas Wolterstorff is essentially, and this is a paraphrase, again, I apologize, I'll put the quote in the description, but God allowed so much suffering in the world, rivers of blood to run, bonds of love beyond number to be snapped. If you haven't abandoned us, explain yourself. And he says he didn't get an answer, nor has he ever, but what he saw through his tears and through the clouds of grief was God himself in the person of Jesus suffering with us. He didn't give us an answer. He just came to be with us, and he suffered. And that doesn't answer our questions, but it makes them less pressing. It helps us trust someone who has that sort of integrity and compassion.
I guess the only other thing I would add is that, kind of like that quote shows, it's I don't think God is offended by people saying things like that. I mean the Psalms show that, like, God can handle our thoughts and our feelings, and so I would say to people who are like tempted to just check out on God because of this, just to keep the conversation going. I mean, whatever you're feeling, talk about it, but talk to him about it. Like, don't just withdraw. he can handle it, and it's important to keep that communication open.
Yeah.
And kind of like you said about not ever getting an answer. I mean, I think kind of the starting point of any kind of conversation like this has to be an acceptance on some level of there being an element of mystery here. Because I mean, if you ever meet anybody who says they've gotten this problem figured out, don't believe them.
Right. Right. 3 easy steps to never suffer again.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, some religions, you know, like I think of Buddhism, like, you know, one of the fundamental tenets tends to be like a more stoic attitude. Like you just kind of renounce your desires, and because desires cause suffering, and there's existentialism, which kind of offers an irrational solution. You know, the world sucks, but just have a good attitude irrationally anyway. You know, and like Christianity doesn't invite you to have an irrational. You know, like there's no basis whatsoever for hope, but I'm just gonna have hope anyway. Like, I mean, the Bible says there actually is a basis for hope, and if we can't see that basis in our daily life, that doesn't mean it's not there. It just means we have to be content with not knowing everything in the meantime, you know.
And that's the conclusion that Julian of Norwich comes to as well in her Revelations, is God has proven himself time and time again to be more glorious and beautiful than we can understand, and better to us than we can imagine. His will towards us has always been good and will continue to be. And he asks us to endure a little while, to be patient as we wait with him, and to trust him, to trust. Actually, Mother Teresa has a great quote. There was a person who went over there who was a professor on sabbatical and went to India to work with her, and he said, "Man, Mother Teresa, will you please pray for me? I really need clarity." And she said, "No, I'm not going to pray for you for clarity. You've made an idol out of it, and it's the last thing you're clinging to. What I will pray for you is that you'll trust God." And it's hard, man. And all of this is hard. It's not easy. Even Jesus himself, you know, sweat blood in the garden and cried out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But just be with Jesus in those places. You know, don't let the conversation end. Continue to engage. Recognize that Jesus is in those places with you, suffering, praying, crying out, groaning.
This is not a book, but to your point, the song "Hard to Get" by Rich Mullins is a good song for people who are wrestling with this.
Yeah,
it's one of the last songs he wrote.
Hard to get. I'll try to remember to put all of these things in the description of the songs and the books that we've mentioned. And so maybe we can end with this Rich Mullins quote, actually from a different song, that maybe it can be our creed for now. But, you know, if I stand, let me stand on the promise that you'll pull me through. And if I can't, then let me fall on the grace that first brought me to you. Thanks, man. Do you think we solved this problem for all time?
No. But hopefully we didn't make it worse.
Yeah. God bless you. Hopefully it didn't make it worse.